Welcome to the Inspired Caring podcast, where women who are in the messy middle of this big, beautiful, and sometimes chaotic life are finding inspiration and resources to care for themselves and figure out the best options to care for their aging loved ones. How we take care of ourselves today impacts how we are aging tomorrow. This podcast will help you feel seen, centered, and aligned. Everyone that relies on you is so lucky to have you in their life. The Inspired Caring podcast is your reminder that the number one person that counts on you is yourself. Congratulations on being here in this moment. Let's dive in and be inspired. Today on Inspired Caring, I'm very delighted to welcome Bruce Lederman, an experienced senior living professional, extensive background in this field. And we're going to be talking about 2026 and why this is a tipping point in senior living. And I think so many families have a lot of confusion and questions about senior living. And obviously, for those of us in the industry, we want to see more, I think, and better. So Bruce is going to share his wisdom with us. Thanks for being here today.
Michelle, thank you so much for having me, and greetings to all your lovely listeners.
I would love to hear, I always like to hear how people ended up in this space, because people don't often just wake up and think, oh, older adults, gerontology, senior living, this is the path for me. So let's just start with that.
Well, thank you. Actually, for me, I didn't end up. I started in the senior living industry. I'm an attorney by background, and after law school, I knew I didn't want to practice law. My skill set lay in other areas. My dreams were outside of the realm of the legal profession. And my sister, who's a few years older than me, an occupational therapist by training, had entered the rehab space and was providing rehabilitation services to hospitals and skilled nursing centers. And she had gotten an interest in, well, maybe I should operate and lease a skilled nursing center. And so I actually went to work for her almost out of law school. And then we ended up having a couple of nursing homes and operated that for a few years. I left the industry for a little bit and went into financial services in my 40s. But I quickly returned and then soon arrived here at Charles E. Smith Life Communities, where I am now. But in my nonprofit career, outside of my profession, I always, even in the 40s, had kept a hand in the industry. And I was on the board of CJE Senior Life, which is a Jewish faith-based provider of senior care services in the Chicago area, and was board chair there and actually continue to serve, although I'm not officially on the board, ex officio. I don't vote anymore. So my whole career has been really spent in the senior living space. And I think part of it, and I think for many of my colleagues in this space, and probably for you as well, we have memories of our grandparents perhaps, and grew up, if you were fortunate, in a multi-generational household. And so older people were we understood that they were just an older version of us, even though when we're quite young, we can't quite grasp that. But over time, we do recognize it. And so it only seemed natural that I spent my career in this space.
I grew up in a household with a granddaddy.
There you go.
We moved from Brooklyn Heights, New York to Berkeley, California to move into the house with my stepmom, and her dad had been living with her. And so for 12 years, he lived in the house that I was growing up in. And it was his last final years. He did move to a nursing home to receive care because it was the best option for him. It's what he needed. So you grew up in this space. You've seen the changes that have been made and have some thoughts about kind of where we're headed. I think it's also helpful to have a healthy perspective of kind of where we were as an industry, not necessarily the homes that you had created for people, and to where we are today. Can you give us a little perspective on that?
Well, I'll give you my perspective.
Yeah.
I go back to 1988 right? It was only a few years before then that the Clausens created Sunrise Senior Living. Assisted living as an industry didn't even exist until the mid 1980s. I mean, there were small board and care homes, of course, and there still are across the country. But the opportunity to really do something that was between living at home, but was not a nursing home, where older adults could have an apartment, but also receive personal care services. That was really a very new concept when I entered the field in the late 1980s. And of course, the other significant change, as we're talking about within the definition of sort of, let's call it institutional living or group housing, was that the skilled nursing space saw the arrival of the first federal regulations and federal standards nationwide. And at that time, many of the states in the country didn't even have state regulations or very modest state regulations as it came to providing services to older adults in a nursing home setting. And soon the arrival not only of the federal rules, but also what's called a minimum data set, which is basically an instrument where you collect all the information you've gathered about the needs and services that an older adult needs who lives in a skilled nursing center. That also came about in the early 1990s, which really revolutionized that field. So I have had the opportunity to witness both of those, and sadly the passing of two generations. Now that I'm entering I'm well into my third decade in senior living. My grandparents' generation and my parents' generation have both entered and sadly exited the senior living space. And so it was interesting to see how the industry adapted to meeting the needs of two different generations, as my own, the baby boom generation, is now knocking on the door.
I think what this helps us to framework as family caregivers is the fact that assisted living is something that has developed and evolved in our lifetime. And so this, I think, plays into why it's so confusing for families, and also why there's so much resistance from older adults, because what they have in their mind are those traditional models of nursing home care when we're talking about making a transition to a senior community. I'm 53, and I feel like for my generation, I guess I get to speak for all of us since I'm the
I will for mine if you do for yours.
since we're the ones having the conversation. I think that, a couple things are feeling true. One, we have a better understanding of what assisted living could look like as a lifestyle, and the accommodations and things that are being put into place to really meet people's interests and help keep people independent and active. And then I think also there's this care burden and care strain that Gen X is feeling right now that leaves, I think, us a little bit more open to maybe senior housing in the future. But for our parents, it's sometimes still a little hard for them to wrap their heads around.
So I am not one that is prone to sort of generational observations. I think each family is unique in time. My own great grandmother, who I knew, she lived to be 101 years old. In 1954, when she was in her 70s and her husband passed away, she said to my grandmother, "Well, it's time for me to go to the old folks home." And off she trotted to the old folks home. Little did she know she'd be living for another 26 years. But it was sort of what was done in those days. And also they had very modest incomes. And I'd like to get back to that during our chat today about how economics drive options, not surprisingly, in the country as we look about options for older adults. But so there's an experience of, 3 generations ago. And my own parents, both actually passed away in my sister's home and did not live in a senior living residence. I think as we plan for aging, and we're looking at our own parents, for you, for instance, talking about your parents, it's more about what are their goals?
Mhm.
What are their desires for how they want to age? Now, of course, there may be an inflection point where those goals and aspirations need to change because of physical limitations that may develop over time. If one person was not a planner, let's say in life, they won't suddenly become a planner at age 80, you know? And I think we all need to be humble when approaching, especially someone we love, our aunties, our uncles, our parents, and recognizing that we were not present for the first third of their journey, right? It's like a novel. All of a sudden we started reading in the middle of the book and caught on, but we weren't there for the beginning chapters. So in some ways we need to understand that we don't understand how they are who they are in that way. And as we try to promote their sense of agency and autonomy, which, like I said, older people are simply an older version of us.
I fully embody that statement. I mean, I truly believe that. I don't know if you've seen those Tom Husey photographs. He's a
Oh,
photographer with the reflections.
right.
They're so powerful. It's an older adult looking in the mirror, and a younger version of themselves is reflecting back to them.
My father's mother of blessed memory, okay, who lived to be 87, commented at her 85th birthday, I look in the mirror and I see an older woman, but inside I feel like I'm 17. And I think everyone truly feels that way. We don't understand our age in the sense of who we are as we appear to the world.
This is why the field of gerontology is so fascinating, and I keep
Mhm.
keep pursuing education there. I want to get back to the
Mhm.
economics of aging, because I think that is a core source of strain for so many families, especially for older adults who are maybe lived through the Depression and are still with us, even, or on the not on the tail end of the Depression. Their parents lived through the Depression, and
Mhm.
so they have a different money mindset than maybe we with our Amazon culture.
It as we talk about
Absolutely.
options and opportunities for older adults, I think there's many lenses to look through it. And I think this issue of an economic lens is really of paramount importance. As we started off just a little while ago in our chat talking about assisted living, and to a very large extent, the assisted living option in the United States is really solely one that can be privately funded. Now, someone may have, let's say, long-term care insurance to help augment that, but of course, that's predicated upon having had the income to be able to have purchased a long-term care policy and being
Right.
the type of person who would do so. Only not that large number of states have Medicaid programs that will also fund an older adult who's Medicaid eligible, meaning they are of lower income, to be able to live in assisted living. So in many states, that's just not an option. So unless you're able to be supported with home and community-based services, the only other option is living in a skilled nursing center, regardless of whether or not you're still could live a very full and healthy life in assisted living. So that's one item that comes to mind automatically. But then also the availability of affordable senior living in the United States, in an independent living situation, and the availability of those apartments, and especially for um, the middle market. So older adults who are not necessarily low income qualified for low income housing, but the type of senior living slash independent living being built today is simply out of their financial reach. And that middle market is enormous, but solving for it is not easy given cost of construction, cost of labor, cost of land. So there's a lot of challenges as we look at the landscape today. It's not simply about build it and they will come. I think there's a lot of it's challenging time.
It really is. We were really lucky as a family because my in-laws had the foresight and they were the planners that purchased long-term care insurance. And so as a result, when my mother-in-law was diagnosed with dementia, she had lived with dementia for 12 years, and the last 3 years of her life, she was living in memory care. So it, thank God, was able to cover her stay. And then my father-in-law ended up with a terminal cancer diagnosis, and he ended up moving into assisted living, activated his long-term care insurance policy, and he died first.
Wow.
So we were, financially, it didn't ruin us to have two family members in
Right.
senior living. Where do you think we're headed in 2026 as we start to sort through this middle? I mean, maybe this is two different questions. Maybe it's the middle population who either are on Medicaid or can private pay, or just in general.
Wow. You know what? I wish I had that crystal ball, but I'll take I'll share you some thoughts that I have about where we are today. Conscious of the fact that as everyone, as the media continually reminds us, the oldest boomers turn 80 this year, which really is a bit of a magic number in terms of being the next generation that's really going to start utilizing the senior living spectrum of services. So one important note, right? I think it was in 2020, right before the pandemic, maybe in 19, that for the first time, the Medicaid program on a national basis was spending more money for home and community-based services than for skilled nursing. And I think that was a very important moment in the history of senior living in the U.S., in that it recognized, the federal government recognized that the reality is that simply institutionalizing older adults simply because they're older is a non-starter. People don't want to live in a nursing home, and of course it is terribly expensive regardless. But especially if someone does not need that level of care, why is that the only option? So I think that was a significant milestone that we passed. And then, of course, since the pandemic, but even before the pandemic, we saw greater interest in the Program for All-Inclusive Care for the Elderly, or PACE. And that program is now over 50 years old, having started in the San Francisco Bay Area in the early 70s. Now, sadly, I think there's still less than 200 PACE centers in the United States. That's quite a difference than, let's call, the 14,000 nursing homes in the United States, and I think maybe 16,000 assisted living centers. And for those of your listeners who aren't familiar with PACE, the PACE program is basically sort of an enrollment model. The two criteria for enrolling is that you need to be a Medicaid eligible older adult, meaning that you are of lower income. And secondly, it must be determined by an independent third party that you are at risk for moving into a nursing home. And that could be because of cognitive decline or because you need assistance with activities of daily living. And rather than moving into a skilled nursing center, these PACE programs are basically like adult day service programs, but on steroids, where there's a center. About 300 people belong to a PACE program, I think is the average size in the States. And that PACE program is sort of your insurer. It covers all the expenses, your laboratory fees, pharmacy costs, home care costs, transportation costs, if you need personal care, if you go to the hospital, therapy costs. It's really an incredible program. Amazingly, only available to Medicaid beneficiaries in the U.S. But that program is growing rapidly. And I think that does show another direction of how aging is changing in the States, recognizing, again, to keep people who do not want to live in a skilled nursing center, giving them options. And again, I don't want to give the impression, there are wonderful skilled nursing centers in the United States doing amazing work, but this is about options and about people having a sense of agency and autonomy as they age. And then I think another trend that we're seeing, of course, is the rise of private duty home care. Again, this is a financially driven model. But nevertheless, many older adults want to stay in home, even if the home they're living in might not necessarily be the home where they had raised their family. It might be an apartment or a condominium that they had moved to after they sold the house where if they had a family, they had raised their family, but they want to remain in community. And so private duty home care does afford that option. Now, of course, there's other challenges, social isolation, for instance, meal preparation that might drive someone as they age in community to say, you know what, maybe living in a more congregate setting would be more appropriate for me. All that being said, I don't know if you saw the article in the New York Times over the weekend. I'd read it last week about an 86-year-old woman who's led a very bold and dynamic life, who lives in a remote part of Washington state. And simply because she's 86 and living alone, she didn't want to abandon that lifestyle. And she now has, which is referred to, I think, a bit of misnomer, a robotic attendant who lives with her. In truth, it's a tabletop device, which is based on artificial intelligence and engages with her. The article is fascinating, and I think it shows a window and raises questions about what socialization looks like and connection as we age. But it's really a very, very interesting window into something that I sense is going to be something a technology that's going to play a larger and larger role in our lives.
I did not see the article. I will definitely be going to look it up and read it. I agree with you on that social connection and how AI and technology is really going to transform options. I mean, what we're talking about here, just having options available. There is something about human touch. So it will be, I mean, as a social gerontologist, it's going to be very interesting to see the research on this and where it takes us, and how is it setting us up for success, and how is it missing on every mark. I mean, the PACE programs, there's so much value in them, and I did not know that there were only 200 in the country. And it also provides that human contact, interaction, daily programming for people to attend.
Right. And staying on the point of PACE programs for just a moment more, so here's an example where policy could be changed and PACE could be expanded. And what do I mean by that? So as I noted earlier, PACE program, you need to be Medicaid eligible in order to avail yourself of the program. Now, that's not quite true. Theoretically, you could pay privately and participate in PACE. But because of the way the Medicare Part D program, the pharmacy benefit, is arranged, it really it puts people who want to pay privately at a dramatic disadvantage. The program is very expensive. That means that there needs to be a regulatory fix. And that is something that Washington could affect change on. And this is an example, again, I think, of where, like it or not, there are policy issues that really do lay at the doorstep of our politicians and the government partners to see how we can create more opportunities to age better with more options in the country. And I think the expansion of PACE, both for the current population it serves, but also to expand it beyond that population, is a great conversation, a policy conversation that we need to have sooner rather than later.
Our legislature's in session, and they are looking at pretty significant cuts for Medicaid programs and services in the state. And I think people are underestimating the ripple effect and impact that is going to have in our community. I was thinking about, if someone is living with a form of dementia, in the state of Nebraska, we have 35,000 people who have an actual Alzheimer's diagnosis. 40,000 private family caregivers are providing their care. We have 800 memory care beds in the state of Nebraska. We surveyed those 800, the companies who have those 800 beds, and asked for a percentage of those beds that are Medicaid beds. Just over 70% of the organizations responded, and we have 18 beds
Right.
in the state of Nebraska. So if someone is living with a diagnosis of a dementia or cognitive impairment, and they are requiring memory care, and they are receiving, and they're a Medicaid eligible person, we're in real trouble.
It's legislative session time across the country.
Yeah.
The House of Delegates is in session here in Annapolis. And this issue about the Medicaid budget is very real across the country. And unfortunately, older adults, when pitted against other communities of need, it's challenging, I think, for advocates, both for older adults themselves advocating on their own behalf, but also those who are allies, to identify why it is that this is important. Here we are over 60 years since the creation of the Medicaid and Medicare program. It's hard to remember that back in the late 1950s and early 1960s, those old over the age of 65 in the United States were the least likely to be able to access medical care. The population that one could reasonably argue had the greatest need, had the least access. And it was because, of course, there was no program to support it. Our own organization, which has been where I am now at Charles C. Smith Life Communities, this is our 116th year. And we have many stories back in the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, the 50s of the Women's Auxiliary, going around to physician offices to get pharmaceutical supplies, such as they were, of course. In those days, there weren't anywhere near as many pharmaceuticals as there are today. But going around from office to office and then bringing them back, and then there would be a volunteer physician, volunteer pharmacist who would divvy up these pills. Mrs. Johnson gets this, and well, we don't have anything for Mrs. Tate today. And that is the world older adults lived in before the two federal bedrock programs. Having been in the industry for almost 40 years, I will say that the regulatory approach, I'll juxtapose the regulatory approach to hospitals as against nursing homes. So hospitals have the Joint Commission of Accreditation, which is both the organization that is holding them to JCAHO standards, the acronym, and at the same time coaching them to JCAHO standards. I don't know at what point, and I think that the thought was that the regulatory framework has to be draconian, that the standards themselves need to be such that you can't have consultation. The federal regulations for nursing homes, for instance, have a contract with the state's Department of Public Health to conduct these surveys. But why can't they also be coaches? At the same time that they're holding nursing homes to standards, why is it that we can't have an environment where best practices are being shared, nursing home providers are being held to standards? It's a question that I have. In general, philosophical question. That's a whole other program, Michelle. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. I mean, having worked in a nursing home for 5 years, and every time the state would come into the building, we were being guided as a leadership team to, let's just show them what we got. Let's show them how we do things here,
Right.
and hope that the survey team would be, I mean, never lenient, but like if there was something that needed to be addressed, we certainly wanted to have that ability to address it.
Right.
And do better, because that's what our goal was to take care of people. And so that's what you've been doing for 3 decades in senior living, is taking care of people.
Our skilled nursing center is the largest in Maryland by licensed beds. And we also, because of that, we have the largest number of Medicaid beneficiaries in any skilled nursing location in the state of Maryland. Now, of course, Maryland's a very small state compared to where I'm from, which is Illinois. But that's an expression of our mission as an organization. We do have assisted living on our campus, but we also offer 500 apartment units on our campus, 250 units of affordable senior housing, and 250 units of what we call market rate senior housing on our 38-acre campus as well. And then as a single site provider, this is our only location where we support older adults. I think we're in the top 15 in the country for nonprofits in terms of our size, something like this. So we have tremendous talent, our 800 associates, a remarkable board, and our lay leaders who populate our committees and the boards of our organization, and then of course the community that we serve. It's really, I could go on and on about how proud I am of what we accomplish here at Charles E. Smith Life Communities.
Well, that's beautiful. It's nice to know that there are really connecting places where people can receive affordable housing and care. It's really a focus of Omaha right now is affordable housing. Something that our mayor is now committed to, which is very exciting as an age-friendly community aligning with AARP. So,
that's terrific.
Yeah. So when we think about just senior living in general, I'm curious, how do families play a role in your community? In my experience, they were often front and center or not very present, kind of depending on the geography of where someone was living and their family members. Are families something that are top of mind for your organization?
I always like to talk about resident representatives because I want to lift up that not every older adult had children or had nephews and nieces, and so sometimes our families of choice are. I want to be inclusive and make sure that we encompass them in our conversation about families. It's remarkable what the pandemic taught us about certain things. I'll give you an example. So early on in the pandemic, for instance, like many places across the country, we had to close to visitors. All of a sudden, we learned that about 40% of those who live in one of our senior living buildings, their children were dividing up and placing their medication and setting up their medication boxes on a weekly or monthly basis. We, of course, had no eyeballs into that because it's independent living. But there is where you see that simply because an older adult moves into a congregate setting, one should not presume that that support is still not taking place, right, from people who love them in the community. As a matter of fact, about a third of the older adults who live on our campus aren't from this area. Their children settled at some point in the Maryland, or the DMV as we call it, the northern Maryland suburb, Northern Virginia, suburban Maryland in the District of Columbia. And so they relocated here often after having had some retirement years in a warmer climate. And we have town hall meetings across campus for all of our families on a monthly basis. And many of our volunteer programs, many of our volunteers on campus are family members or resident representatives of those we serve. And then many opportunities for the programming so that families of older adults or their friends can be engaged in engaging activities that are furthering, a sense of project about aspirations that we have, we being as individuals, in order to support that. And also recognizing that older adults, on this theme of they're just like us but older, not every older adult has children who are interested in visiting with them for whatever reason. There are life choices there that were made, or whatever that looked like, and so someone may find themselves, or they had no children, living in senior living, and friends are visiting them, or did they develop new friendships on campus? I'm often reminded, early in my career as a nursing home administrator, we had a resident who was well over 100. She had never married, and yet for her birthday parties, the dining room was filled with nephews and nieces and great nephews and great nieces and grandchildren of cousins. it was remarkable. And this was all of her extended family.
So I appreciate you sharing that language around inclusion for families and chosen family and representatives. And I know that at one point you were on the board of SAGE.
Mm.
And I think that if we can have that conversation, I just feel like we've seen tremendous strides in acceptance and inclusion and people having the lives that they choose to live. And I'm curious if, as people are aging and moving towards senior living, if we feel like in senior living that we have spaces where people can continue to be themselves.
Michelle, this isn't a program on politics. My answer would have been different a few years ago than it is today. Certainly, we would want, and as a gay man, I would want to be able to age in an environment and I can be open and honest about my life with my neighbors if I choose to live in a senior living campus. I think when we start discussing about the intersection of senior living and let's say the federal programs, maybe it's kind of a challenging time right now. I think for older adults living, regardless of whether they're living in a rural or in an urban setting, we also need to remember that whole conversation we had earlier about economics and the intersection of economics and choice. I think certainly if one is able, has financial resources and lives in a larger urban setting, which had a more diverse population, I think it is easier to find a community where one can find it to be a welcoming and open environment. Certainly SAGE, for your wonderful listeners who aren't familiar with it, it's the nation's largest organization serving LGBTQ older adults. The tagline is, "We refuse to be invisible." So you can see from that tagline all the programs that could flow from that. And certainly SAGE even has a certification program where senior living providers can self-identify of having had culture competency training for their workforce in order to create a more welcoming environment. Now, I don't. This can all become very controversial, and that wasn't the point of me going there. But I wanted to share with your listeners that this certification does exist. It is not pushing any agenda, other than one where we're recognizing older adults are simply an older version of ourselves. And I think that the chapters to that book are not finished yet, Michelle. I definitely one hears stories that are very upsetting about LGBTQ people who find themselves, whether it's in affordable housing or in a skilled nursing center or in assisted living, where their choices are they are being diminished, and even situations where the intersection of their sexual or gender identity with dementia, right, and guardianship, and who is making decisions for them, and are the decisions that they are making for them consistent with who they were in their lifetime, right? It gets very complicated very quickly, especially in today's culture.
Well, I think it's such a valuable, important conversation for us to all be having, just because, I think of senior care in general, just the whole ecosystem of senior care is like taking 1,000-piece puzzle and dumping it on the table and trying to like sort the pieces and fit it all together. So I think there's just so much value in bringing awareness to organizations that are here and around and available, and really layering the complexity of how aging is not linear. And so
it's a great point. And your program is a great example of one of those pieces in the puzzle, right? Because it's these conversations where someone is able to see, they get a doorknob and they get to see the possibilities. It's an entry point into understanding the complexity of the choices that are available in senior living, that there is no one path. It's not linear. Great phrase. I love the analogy with the puzzle. I'm going to steal that, I think.
Yes.
Because I often say, you have a parent, they're in terrific health. How's your mom? Oh, my mom's great. She's 85. She drives, and she's got, mahjong class, and she's all kinds of things. Her neighbors take her out, and then mom falls. Yeah. And you don't live in the town where mom lives. And you never thought about any of these questions. And now all of a sudden, I liken it to it's like a game of Survivor. You've been dumped and you're now landed on this island. You don't know where the fresh water is. You don't know where the trees are. You don't know where the sandy beach is. And decisions need to be made in real time. And some people are planners, like your in-laws, and having purchased long-term care insurance and thinking about what aging would look like. And other people aren't. I mean, it's not their nature. They're not planners. There's no opprobrium attached to it. It's not their nature. But then that means, when something happens, okay, how do we ramp up to speed as quickly as possible, be as knowledgeable with what we need to make the best decision we can at this time?
Yeah, we're all operating at the speed of information.
Another great phrase. I like it. Indeed. Absolutely.
Yeah, I use that all the time with my clients, because when you, in hindsight, are reflecting and doing the shoulda, coulda, woulda to yourself or your siblings or, other people in the care partnership, that's not the information we had at the time.
Right.
So we're just doing the best we can with what we have. This is a really good conversation. Thank you.
No, my pleasure. I'm thinking about these puzzle pieces. Some people think, well, everyone who lives works in the senior care field, of course, how lucky are your parents, right? Because you're in this field, but it's like a firefighter, right? Just because you work as a firefighter doesn't mean that you necessarily respond as quickly as you should in the real instance. I recall my own father, who was on a slow, gentle decline, quite frankly. He died on his birthday at age 95 and played his last round of golf 6 months before he passed. But the truth was, the last 3 years of his life, he was on decline. And my sister and I sort of witnessed it, and here she is. She's an occupational therapist, and I'm a licensed nursing home administrator and spent my career in it. And it never occurred to either of us, maybe it's really a time to talk about palliative care for Dad. Maybe we should have this conversation with him about what are his goals and in his medical treatment, and at an appropriate time expanding that conversation and talk about hospice. Because the reality is, hospice only showed up in his life for the last few weeks of life. And truthfully, he could have been on hospice for months, and it really could have made a difference. Not that he had a bad quality of life, but it could have been enhanced. It could have been enhanced. A music therapy program would have been great for him in the last stages of life. And there you go, with making the best decisions, right, in real time. And yet you're also confronted with these needs, and you sort of forget some of your training.
Oh my gosh, absolutely. I have multiple friends who are in this space who have had parents say to them, if only we could get some guidance from a professional for grandma. It's like, oh my gosh. Well, that is the I in intent in caring. It's an acronym, and I is intentions. What are that person's intentions for their own life, and what are your intentions as we're coming to the care partnership?
Right. How often do we avoid the difficult in air quotes for your listeners conversations, not because we're uncomfortable, right? Not because the conversation, not because we're limiting it because of ourselves, not because of the necessity to have the conversation, to simply open the door and then see what our parent or our auntie, how do they respond to having this conversation? They may have been waiting for us to open the door on this conversation. They were afraid to bring up a subject that is defined as quote unquote difficult because they didn't know how we'd feel about it, right? They wanted to protect us. Very interesting.
Yeah, it's incredibly interesting. And I feel like I know for sure, I know personally, professionally, when we delay decision making, we're delaying care for older adults. And I think sometimes what I witness is also an older adult bringing up a topic and then being brushed off by people because it is, oh, don't talk like that. Oh, we don't want to, you're going to live forever.
Right. Right. So you know, part of ageism, I think, is rooted in this dynamic. And that is, it's about our fear about growing older.
Mm.
And so we don't want to have the conversation. I say we as a country, we
Mhm.
don't want to have the conversation because we don't want to talk about end of life conversations. And so we push it aside due to our own fears, not thinking about the human being that we're having a conversation, a dialogue with, right? And the richness and the opportunity that can come from that that may ameliorate our fears. And also, we need to give one another grace. I mean, how many in your career, I'm sure you've met clients, and the family dynamic is one in which the adult children, some of whom now are in their 50s and 60s, all right, but as they relate to their parent, the relationship, it's as if they're still around the family table and they're teenagers and their parents are in their 30s. And so, we do need to give space to recognize that families are complicated, relationships are complicated. Sometimes the development that was needed in order to support these kinds of conversations at the end of life were made impossible by events from 4 or 5 decades earlier. And patterns were established that just make it impossible to have those conversations now. It's really, well, it's part of the I want to say complications, but part of the opportunity, I think, of being in the senior living space or serving older adults is recognizing the complexity of our family relationships and just acknowledging that.
100%. It's really the foundation of what inspired caring is all about. And caring's an acronym around which stands for calm, assess, resources, intentions, navigate, and grounding. Like every phase of the caregiving journey, every person that we're caring for, dementia, cancer, this has just been my experience and the research that I've done. Those just seem to be key elements to be able to thrive during this chapter. And I think you and I both want people to stay home for as long as possible and then have as many options open to them to meet their needs and how they want to age, and then make sure that people are being cared for in a dignified way wherever they call home.
It's the ideal. It's absolutely the ideal. As I think about my own aging, initially I had thought, well, I want to live as home as long as possible. But I have a feeling since I don't have children, I think now as I'm now into my 60s, I could see moving into a senior living community when I'm, healthy. But at a certain point, because I want to develop relationships with the people who are there, with the staff, with the management, have other sets of eyeballs on me so that the slight declines that I may not recognize in myself, they may catch. And putting myself in an environment where hopefully, though I'm blessed to have nieces and a nephew, where their love for me is supported by those who are professionals who are actually have eyeballs on me.
I am 100% in that camp too. And I suspect you and I would also at some point potentially be walking around that community saying, you don't understand. We work here. I work here.
Totally. I mean, I think about that all the time, moving into senior living and saying, well, let me tell you the way we used to do it.
Yeah.
I
Well,
still, I
my
mean,
day.
I'm still am blessed to have friends from early on in my career, and they were, a decade or two older than me, and we talk on the phone pretty regularly. And they now have been in and out of post-acute care centers and things, and they share their notes. And then they tell me their exit conferences they have with the administrator on what they would do differently. It's fantastic.
I love it. That's the wisdom we need for the future of senior living and senior care.
Totally. Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, we've hit a lot of topics today. Is there anything that we left out that you wanted to talk about and share with the listeners?
Be bold in having conversations with an older adult that you love or you're friends with. When you see an older face, we are not invisible. Okay. People have rich, dynamic, interesting lives. And I know everyone struggles to look through that to see beyond, or maybe not see beyond, but appreciate the older adult that they're seeing and engage with them. My soapbox is really about fighting ageism and recognizing that older adults deserve respect. They planted the trees that we got to sit under when we were kids, and we should acknowledge that and be thoughtful of it.
Thank you so much for being here today. Final question: what is on your playlist? What are you listening to these days?
For podcasts?
Podcasts or music?
I'm a history buff, and I am just going to share The Rest is History. I am mad for that program. I am just mad for The Rest is History. So that is really on my podcast right now.
Perfect. I think you and I are both feeling optimistic about where we're headed. Is that a fair statement?
Amen. Yes, there's always hope.
There's always hope. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Michelle.